Well, welcome everybody. My name's Trewin Restorick. I'm of the charity Hubbub, and our session is called Bounce Back and Move Forwards. So I'm hoping that you can all see the screen, which is the introduction. And I just want to start off by explaining what we're going to be doing and the format which we're going to go through. So Hubbub is an environmental charity that was set up in the UK 6 years ago. And basically the Greenprint, which we're going to talk to you about, has come from our charity. And with me today are two of our trustees, Viki Cooke from Britain Thinks and Dan Smith from Headland Consultancy. And what we're going to do is talk to you about the response that we've taken to the whole COVID pandemic crisis. But I just want to start by explaining a little bit about Hubbub and our background to give you a context for the work that we do. So 6 years ago, Hubbub was created to bring environmental messages to a mainstream audience. And what we decided to do was to talk about things that we think people are passionate about. So we don't come at the conversation from an environmental viewpoint, but rather we talk about the environmental impacts of the clothes that people wear, the food they eat, the homes they live in, and their neighbourhoods. We decided that a small environmental charity couldn't change the world on its own. So we collaborate with large companies, including people like IKEA and Starbucks. We decided that we wanted to run practical and positive change campaigns built around great behaviour techniques and brilliant design. We then wanted to measure absolutely everything we did as thoroughly as possible and openly share results, both good and bad, so that people would learn from the mistakes and hopefully copy all the best bits. And finally, we decided that we didn't really mind if nobody had heard of Hubbub. It was the change that we were trying to inspire that was the most important rather than the organisation. So the slide in front of you now is a very simple example of one of our campaigns. This was trying to reduce littering on our high streets. We did lots of research and we found out that the people who were most likely to litter cigarette butts were young blokes, quite often when they were drunk, coming out of pubs and bars. And we decided that perhaps a small sticker saying, please don't drop your cigarette butt would be the best way to reach that audience. So what we did was we created a voting cigarette bin. And the first question we asked is, who's the best footballer in the world? Is it Ronaldo or Messi? Vote with your cigarette butts. It's a very simple approach. It immediately cut cigarette littering in the area by around 30%. And since that one sort of very conceptual design, we've produced bins and sold them all around the world. And we've had brilliant questions like, is Donald Trump's hair real? And in the UK, we probably had quite a few about Brexit as well, so I'm sure you can imagine. So that's just a flavour of sort of the playful way that we try and engage people in the environmental topic. And as soon as the lockdown hit the UK, we, like many other organisations, immediately had to totally transform what we're doing. We started to work remotely at home. But more importantly, we started to look at the projects we were delivering, because many of our campaigns were about social interaction and people meeting. And obviously, in a lockdown, that's not possible. So we changed everything we did. But much more importantly for that, for us, was that we wanted to assess what the wider term impact would be around the sustainability agenda and the climate change agenda. And we wanted to make sure that we stayed relevant and on top of the entire debate. So we basically did three things. The first was we undertook a lot of public polling and sought experts to try and assess the public mood. We ran 5 workshops with over 200 businesses, talking to them about how they were adapting, what they saw were the long-term changes, and basically how they saw the future panning out against their sustainability and climate targets. And then from that, we devised some policy asks for government in order to rebuild the UK economy in a way that was more sustainable and just. So that was the background to this session. And what we're going to do is, in a minute, Viki Cooke from Britain Thinks, who will introduce herself, we'll go through the public mood and assessing the mood of the nation. Dan will then talk about the company response. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the policies that arose from all of that. We had a run through a bit earlier and had like a last minute technical hitch. So I'm really hoping that the slides and the technology holds us all together through those presentations. And I would ask that if you do have any questions, please stick them in the chat function, and we'll get to those at the end of the three presentations. So that's the scene setter. Viki, can I hand over to you now, and I will drive your slides for you.
Of course. Thanks very much, Trewin. Hello, everybody. I'm Viki Cooke, founding partner of a company called Britain Thinks, and then our international arm, World Thinks. We are an insight and strategy consultancy. And what I'm going to do with you today is to share some key insights on the public mood in the UK 6 months after lockdown began. These insights are drawn largely from the coronavirus diaries, which is something we did ourselves that follows the lives of 50 people through the pandemic. But also we've been working very closely with government for the last 6 months. So some of the kind of background to this is also we've conducted more than 150 focus groups and 200 depth interviews of our own and looked at lots of people's polling. So I'm just going to try and draw some overarching insights from that. But before I start talking about anything to do with climate change, I'm going to start with the wider context. And the reason for that is we passionately believe that context is everything. And in order to succeed, you need to start from where people are, not where you wish they were. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the mood of the nation in the UK. And the public mood is febrile. At the moment, the public are angry. There's been a real loss of confidence and trust in the government here, who are thought to be making mistake after mistake, constantly making U-turns, not demonstrating respect for the public, repeatedly making boastful overclaims that are then not delivered, and a government that's just not prepared to acknowledge mistakes. So the public have got really very angry. In the early days here, there was a real mantra of following the science. And originally that was kind of really reassuring. And the clarity of a total country lockdown was understood and well supported by people. But that support started to be undermined in May. The Prime Minister made what I'm afraid was a fairly shambolic speech to the nation on May the 10th. And then people really started questioning what was happening. And there was a sort of growing awareness that we'd really failed in areas. So things like PPE for frontline staff wasn't available. Testing's always been a problem here, protecting our care homes. And then, of course, we had the incident of Dominic Cummings, who's chief strategy advisor to the Prime Minister, broke what we all thought up till that point were rules, and went to Barnard Castle. And after that, the public just started to get incredibly angry and mistrusting of government. So much so that some recent research by the Pew Foundation shows that only 46% of the British public believe the country has done a good job in dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. And this is the lowest level support of the 14 countries research, even behind the US. And the 14 country median was 73%. So the Brits are not feeling good about this. So against this backdrop, it's incredibly hard for the government to communicate effectively or persuasively with the public, who greet everything they hear with deep scepticism. And at the moment, the public are kind of really confused about what the guidance is. The perception is here that it just keeps changing, and often new advice is introduced in a sort of fairly haphazard and piecemeal way. It also, which I think is probably the single biggest challenge for government, is it consistently fails to pass what people describe as the common sense test. Why can't you see your grandmother in her own garden, but you can see her in the pub? It just doesn't make any sense to people. It doesn't make any sense to them that it's safe to go into work because somehow magically the virus doesn't get transmitted in the workplace, but it does in your home. So people just don't really believe that the advice is very sensible. So in the absence of trust in the advice, people are more and more using their own judgment to decide what they're happy to do and what personal level of risk they're prepared to take. And that's partly why we're seeing so many young people out and about, because for many of them, they just kind of think, oh, it's over. And quite honestly, they don't feel very much at risk, and they're really bored. So they're just voting with their feet and going out again. But others who are often a bit older, or those close to someone who's vulnerable, they're waiting to see. And we have very much in the UK a sort of 3-week view on the world. So we wait to see what happens 3 weeks after a change has been made. And at the moment, we're all waiting to see what happens now that schools have opened up. So against that, it's not that surprising that the public mood is one of anxiety, concern, frustration and anger. So that gives you a little bit of the context in which we're operating, but it's not all bad news. So there is, through all of this, people have taken real stock. And for many, the lockdown has given them a real opportunity to think hard about all aspects of their life. And lots of people talk about how much they've loved some of the simple pleasures, things like time with their family, just going for walks, cooking, baking, playing board games, things that nobody had the time to do before. And also people are connected with nature in a way that they hadn't for a long time. So there's a real sense that, people talk about this, that the planet is having a chance to breathe at the moment. And people are conscious of cleaner air, quieter skies. They talk about noisier birds. So just a real sense of noticing different things. And lots of people have appreciated the slower pace of life, that sense of being off the treadmill. So what we've done is we've learned to value and respect different things. We're connecting to our local communities much more than previously. And we're keen to continue doing that, supporting our local businesses, engaging more with our neighbours, looking out for those who are vulnerable. So people feel really good about those changes. But also valuing essential workers in a way that we just never did before. Not only health and care workers, the health workers particularly who we've seen as the heroes of our time, but also the supermarket workers, the bin men, the bus drivers, all those people who went out there day in, day out in the face of the virus and helped us to keep the nation going. There's also, as you'll all know, been an absolute explosion in the use of technology. Just a few bits of information. Adult internet visitors on average spend 36 minutes longer a day online during April compared to January. 13 million adults used Zoom in April, which was nearly double that in March and 20 times that in January. The number of adults, I think we might have just killed TikTok for the younger generations, because the number of adults accessing TikTok more than doubled to 12.9 million in April compared to February. So now we can all watch the kind of humiliating dad dances that everyone was trying to avoid. But also tech has taken central stage as people develop a range of coping mechanisms and activities. So people have turned to tech in almost every aspect of their lives, whether that's socializing, leisure, personal development, spirituality, exercise, food. So huge uprise in technology. And maybe this is great because for older people, this could be the turning point to get them more involved with technology and less at risk of being digitally excluded. What does all this mean for the climate change agenda? Well, also some real behaviour change has occurred over the last 6 months, not necessarily motivated by climate change, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but nonetheless, extremely welcome behaviour change. So 57% say they're valuing food more, with 48% saying they're wasting less food. 43% say they're spending more time in green spaces. And over a third of people say that they've walked or cycled for journeys that they would otherwise have driven or taken public transport for. 9 in 10 would prefer to work from home at least once a week going forward. But there is, against this, sort of one counter trend that I think is worth thinking about, and that's there's a real fear of public transport, and that's driven many people to using their cars more to go to and from work and things. So there's been a significant upsurge in the purchase of second-hand cars, so people can have 2 cars in their household, and that's obviously a concern. But what we believe is that the key thing now is to cement these and build on these behaviours. But a word of caution, I think it would be an absolute massive mistake to think that many people are motivated to change because of support for climate change. It's always been the case, but in many instances more so now than ever before, that the people who are less affluent and more at risk financially are more motivated by saving money, for example, than they are by the environment. So we would say worry less about why people are doing things and more about how to get them to change their behaviours. And that's very much the kind of model that Hubbub adopts. But there is also crucially a moment of opportunity right now to change and change for the better. Only 9% of the population say that they want to go back to life as it was before the pandemic, and only 6% want to return to the same type of economy as before. So there's a real desire for fundamental change. And we think there are sort of 3 key elements of a reset that people are looking for. Firstly, a fairer future that's more socially just. So in terms of the top 3 priorities for the future from our own polling, 39% say that those who work in essential services should be paid more and treated better. And 34% that the economic recovery should be spread evenly across the country, not just focused on London. The second thing is they're looking for a future that isn't about austerity as the solution to our challenges. Again, in their top 3 priorities, 56% said that the NHS and other public services should be better funded, and only 17% agree that we should cut funding for public services in the future to pay back the money that government borrowed to respond to coronavirus. So a real different type of economy that people are looking for. And for many, there's also a strong desire for sustainability to be a core part of the economic recovery plan. So according to a recent Ipsos Mori poll, 66% expect the government to make protection of the environment a priority in the recovery from COVID-19. And 71% agree it would be wrong not to tackle climate change and pollution as part of the recovery. But as a group of people who are interested in tackling climate change, it's really important to think about the context in which you're communicating right now. So before COVID-19 came on the scene, we had been seeing climate change steadily grow as an issue for the public. In June 2012, 65% of the public said that climate change was something that they were very or fairly concerned about. By June 2020, that had gone up to 81%, and more were very concerned. But right now, not surprisingly, in the face of what we've been living through, it is a lower priority for most people. It's important, but it may be that we need to give careful thought to how we frame the conversation to maximise public support and engagement. Priorities relate at the moment to more immediate concerns around employment, opportunities for young people who are at risk of becoming a lost generation, the very real desire for a fairer, more equal society, support for the levelling up agenda, and the pressing need for more housing. So the more that we can look at climate change solutions within this context and as part of building a building back better solution, the more likely we are to keep taking the public with us. But rest assured, the public is still supportive. 56% disagree that protecting the environment is far down the list of priorities right now. And then the last area that I want to talk about is that of language. It can be very tempting to use somewhat apocalyptic language to describe the severity of the situation. And it can also be tempting to use language that's well understood by the climate change community. But both of these can result in the public becoming less engaged and can have a genuinely perverse effect. The idea of a climate emergency can cause people to question their ability to tackle climate change, particularly on an individual basis. And in the absence of clear leadership from government and business, individuals feel fairly helpless, and it's easy to feel that it's just too late to make a difference. And whilst more people have heard of the phrase net zero, familiarity with the term increased from 52% to 63% between March and June alone this year. Having said that, if you say to people, what does it mean? They completely fall apart and they say, well, I don't know. So if you ask people to explain it, they simply can't. So we are using language that doesn't mean anything to the public, and it's very hard to keep people engaged with something that they just don't really understand what you're talking about. So three bits of sort of thoughts from me to conclude. If we want the public to go with us, then I suggest three things. First, make the conversation inclusive, encouraging, accessible and enabling. Second, ground it within the current context. Don't compete with people's more immediate and pressing fears, become part of the solution to them. And then thirdly, don't focus on the motives for change, focus on the change itself. So hopefully that's given you a snapshot of where the public are right now. And I think I hand over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Viki. So this was where our gremlin hit before. So I'm now stopping showing my screen, which I think has actually worked this time. So we've heard what the public mood is. Dan, do you want to take us through what's happening in the business arena?
Absolutely. Trewin, can you hear me and can you see the screen?
I can see you, can't see the screen. Can see the screen now, Dan. Thank you.
Brilliant. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Trewin, and thank you, Viki, for that. So yes, as Trewin said, my name is Dan Smith. I am a partner at reputation and communications consultancy Headland. We do a mix of corporate communications, campaigning, public affairs, and financial PR for organisations like PepsiCo, Danone, LinkedIn, TikTok, Just Eat, ASOS, Lidl, and UBS, and also work with a lot of sustainability-focused organisations and NGOs such as B Labs and Business for Nature, which gives us a good perspective on how the corporate world has responded to COVID and how it views the opportunities and the challenges of building a more sustainable future, and how something like a Greenprint could align with the corporate mindset at the moment. I think it's fair to say that obviously business has a crucial role in helping deliver a greener, more sustainable future, and in pulling together the Greenprint, Hubbub engaged and consulted over 200 businesses. I think that gives a really good perspective of how organisations are responding both to COVID, but while also addressing those very real sustainability challenges that they have to think about in the context of, say, to a 3 to 5 year plan for the organisation as it looks to rebuild or to capitalise on the opportunities of the coming years. And I just want to spend 10 minutes highlighting some of the external challenges that the corporate world will face in the coming months and years if we are to collectively deliver on a vision similar to that laid out in Hubbub's Greenprint, which Trewin will share shortly. So yes, just to cover reputation management through the crisis, how have businesses responded and where are they now? Secondly, having a quick look at how we can unite societal change with adapting business models, and then some of those potential barriers to be able to deliver on something like a Greenprint. So 3 areas that I'd like to focus on there. So firstly, how has the corporate world largely, and obviously it's hard to generalize, but how has it reacted and now responded to the COVID challenge? Well, I think it's fair to say, first and foremost, that many organisations responded both rapidly and very much with stakeholders and wider society in mind, straight as the crisis hit. The S of ESG, I think, came to the fore in corporate thinking in a way we'd never seen before. It was and remains obviously a very human crisis. However, many sectors are now obviously under long-term pressures and in some cases existential pressure. And reality is obviously starting to bite for sectors and businesses of all shapes and sizes. If you take a look at 2 of Headland's clients here, Pret and LinkedIn, they obviously have very different business models and work in very different sectors, but both now have gone from that initial response of thinking about society, doing things for both staff and for customer base and for those making a wider public effort, through to now thinking through the reality of their own business model pressures. So both have unfortunately had to make redundancies, and both are having to face up to the reality that their bottom line is being hit by some of the challenges that are out there. So I guess the question for the corporate world as we move into the rebuild phase of an economic recovery is, can you firstly adapt your business model to become productive and profitable, while secondly harmonizing with the rapid changes to the way society is operating and the changes to the way that people are behaving and living? And I think it's fair to say that if we are to deliver on a Greenprint collectively, businesses will have to do that. So a really good example of this is Pret, just to look a bit more deeply at that as a case study. Pret, for those that don't know it, is the most successful food-to-go brand in the UK. It's been providing sandwiches and lunches to thousands of city centre workers for years. Pano Crissa, the CEO, recently told the FT that COVID had undone a decade of Pret's growth. They've had to make 3,000 people redundant, and the idea of a sandwich shop in a central business district suddenly feels quite archaic. But it's not all doom and gloom. Pret has an opportunity to embrace a trend which supports a more sustainable way of living, and also presents itself an opportunity to really think through its model and where it fits with society. And that trend is something which is getting a lot of attention at the moment, the idea of the 15-minute city. Pret has already made moves to out-of-town shops and wants to be relevant to being to a way of living where people basically do most of their consuming closer to their household. That also presents the organisation with an opportunity to rethink its supply chain and to rethink some of the more unsustainable elements of its business model. So Pret is a really good microcosm of the ability for business to deliver on a Greenprint, to become more commercially relevant, but also to have to go through a rapid period of change if it is to become commercial in the short term. So if we want to see examples of change happen and business wants to create an environment which allows us to deliver on a better future, what are some of the barriers that might get in the way? I just want to spend a few minutes looking at what I think are 3 key barriers to change. Firstly is a really quite basic challenge, but one which is absolutely critical to what happens next in the corporate world. In many countries, we are seeing or about to see an unemployment crisis, one which is likely to be very deep and one which is likely to amplify inequalities which already exist within societies. That will demand that businesses actually look inwards and engage employees like never before as they change and as their workforce changes shape. And you can see that this is borne out in recent research by Oxford University's Sayed Business School. They interviewed 500 corporate affairs directors from global organizations and found that more attention and effort than ever was going into internal communications. This is obviously necessary. Employers need to do the right thing by their staff in the coming months and years. But the reality is the more energy that is sapped into internal comms, the less an organization has the ability to look outwards and forge the partnerships and the alliances that will be needed to collectively deliver on a Greenprint and deliver on change. And as a slightly sort of, I think, more concerning subplot of that trend is this idea of an employee purpose deficit. That same research by Oxford University showed up a quite worrying trend. Corporate affairs directors do not think that employees are engaged with their organizational purpose. Given the amount of work and energy that has gone in over the past 5 years by the corporate world to ensure that their strategies do align with ESG outcomes and in attempts to breathe purpose into organizations, we should probably be concerned that out of all those all the people that matter and all the stakeholders that matter, employees do not actually believe that their employees, that they are engaged with their organizational purpose. Only 30% of employees are engaged with organizational purpose at the moment. So with many people concerned about their employment status, corporates are going to have to work very hard to empower and motivate workforces to think expansively and outwardly about their role and to ensure that they can contribute to their business's efforts to deliver a better future for all. The second trend is actually, and it's something that Viki talked about in her presentation about language. A lot of the framing in the response to the COVID crisis has talked about resilience. Now, resilience has absolutely a role as a corporate objective. A more resilient business tends to be a more profitable one and one with a more sustainable long-term model. However, as a framing to justify more green and sustainable corporate behaviors, resilience does have a limit. Resilience traditionally in business has been the domain of the risk department. And you can see that is borne out in this research. We looked at business media conversations around topics associated with resilience. And as you'll see, actually, those topics tend to be quite negative ones or ones where you have to face into very, very tough issues. So I think corporates, if they are going to think about resilience, they will need to redefine it within their organizations and make it much more aspirational. Resilience will need to become a shared corporate objective, which as one encourages positive action and does not simply look to mitigate risk. And then the third and perhaps most fundamental trend and factor that I think is a potential barrier to delivering on a Greenprint from a business's point of view is something that we're calling the structural lag. I think we need to acknowledge that many corporate structures are still the construct of 20th century thinking. Today's planetary and societal challenges require what economists term systems level thinking. However, silos between departments all too often remain very real and genuine impediments to delivering organizational-wide sustainable strategies. So I think CEOs need to be honest about where responsibility for delivering on a green agenda lies in their organization. If it is solely the domain of the marketing department or a CSR team with minimal clout, we simply won't deliver on a greener future, as the pace of change will just simply be too slow. So I think businesses need to embrace the wider changes that are taking place through COVID and harness that kind of external investor and regulatory momentum towards greener outcomes to rethink their approaches for the 2020s. Now, that's obviously very easy to say, but much harder to deliver and increasingly hard to deliver when you are, as a business, challenged by the operating environment which COVID is presenting. the truth is that very few organizations take a long-term view when next week's profits are in doubt. So I'll leave you with the words of the brilliant Kate Raworth from her book Donut Economics. The most profound act of corporate responsibility for any company today is to rewrite its corporate bylaws in order to redefine itself with a living purpose rooted in regenerative and distributed design, and then to live and work by it. And those words really do echo loud. To deliver on a Greenprint, businesses will need to heed them. So just to summarize, how can we overcome those barriers, and how can we create the right business environment for change and to deliver on a Greenprint? Firstly, the internal imperative. Businesses will need to work really hard in the coming years to re-engage employees with the business case for sustainable action, and they can't underestimate the resource required to do so as their external environments rapidly change. Secondly, the framing of resilience. I think it's absolutely fine to strive for it as an objective, but don't confuse it with risk mitigation. And then lastly, addressing the structural lag. I think now is the time where the business world really does have to capitalize on societal change and use it as a catalyst to unite internal silos to come up with a more comprehensive answer to the challenges that we face. So thank you very much.
Dan, thank you for that. So we've heard about the public mood. We've heard about the business. What does that mean for policy makers? And that is the piece that I'm now going to move on to. Sorry, I have to quickly flick back very unprofessionally to where we got to. So I hope that slide can be seen. So from Hubbub's perspective, what we heard from all of that was that there is a desire for change, that the social issues have suddenly risen to the fore, that the pandemic has highlighted many structural faults that exist in society to a huge extent, showing our vulnerabilities and particularly hitting those most at risk. And we have also seen, which hasn't been said yet, is that it's basically thrown all the rules of government out of the window. So the UK, as I'm sure you're all too aware, has a very laissez-faire attitude with this government towards getting involved. But basically, COVID has forced the state to get involved to an extent that certainly this government would never have even dreamed possible 5-6 months ago. And I think we're at a pivot point now, which is how does government build back better and fairer? We could go back sort of as to what business was or the country was run like before, because there's a desire to get back and get things moving quickly. Or we could take this moment as a real pivotal moment where we can change for the better. So because of that, Hubbub felt that this was the time for us really to engage with policymakers for the first time in our brief history, and to try and put forward strategies that we felt are important. And so we came up with the Greenprint, which is a set of 10 policy recommendations, which I just wanted to run you through now. And I think the first thing to say is that the policy changes are focused on areas where we have expertise and skills. So, you know, it doesn't cover the whole sustainability remit. It just covers certain areas where we believe we have expertise. And the first thing we looked at was our homes. So people have spent far more time in their homes than they ever had before. And the home setting has become incredibly important for people. And what we've obviously realized is that as people spend more time in home, they use more resources at home, they use more energy, more water, they create more waste at home. And those who have leaky homes or badly sort of built homes are really going to suffer beyond what others are. So our first policy call is around making sure that our homes are far more sustainable. And in the UK, we feel there are two things. One is creating higher minimum standards for new builds. And the second is to have a really extensive retrofit program around energy and water. And we feel that that second area has the opportunity to create new and green jobs. But it's not just the structure of the home that is important. As Viki mentioned, the importance of technology has come to the fore. And in the UK, there are 11 million people who are digitally isolated, who haven't got the basic connections to technology, which many of us take for granted. And at the same time, in the UK, there are 28 million smartphones sitting unused in people's homes. So we're calling for more connectivity between those two sets of issues, and to encourage more refurbishing and recleaning of technology which is sitting around and not in use, and making it available with the right training and support and financing to those people who are digitally isolated. So that's one of our big calls, is how can we create these connected communities? And Hubbub is very much based around practical activity. So in the UK, we've teamed up with O2, who are one of the big mobile providers, and have started to encourage people to donate their phones to us. We refurbish them and digitally clean them, and then they're being sent around to those who are isolated so they can connect with their families and with their carers. And it's been sort of quite heartbreaking, actually, the stories of isolation that we're hearing. So that's the first of the 5 policy areas on your homes. We want greener homes, both through new build and retrofitting, and we want people in homes to be digitally connected. The second issue we've looked at is food, and just again to reinforce what Viki said, people's attitude to food has been transformed during the pandemic. People for the first time started to worry about the availability of food. A lot of people spent a lot more time cooking than they ever dreamed possible. And what that's meant is that people are starting to value food more than they had previously. But at the moment, food waste is a massive issue in the UK. We currently throw away 10 million tonnes of edible food a year. And much of that comes from food businesses, and less than a third of those businesses openly and transparently and independently report on the food waste they create. So our policy ask on food is to encourage all large food manufacturers to independently measure their food waste, to publish the results, and we believe that by having that transparency and openness, we will drive steps to reduce the amount of food waste that's created in the UK. We also saw immediately that the lockdown hit, the fragility of the UK food system. So we had lots of manufacturers and producers who were selling into sort of restaurants and that sort of space, and their market suddenly disappeared. So we had stories of farmers having to throw away milk or meat products because they didn't have a market. And at the same time, people were struggling to get the food they wanted. There was empty supermarket shelves. So we have a very siloed food system, which is vulnerable to these sort of shocks. So what we would like to see is more connectivity in the food system. And one example of that at Hubbub is a network of community fridges. So there are now 100 community fridges around the UK. Basically, they take perishable food, which is often healthy food, from retailers, from manufacturers. It's stored immediately in a freezer or chilled space so it stays healthy to eat. And then anybody from within the local community can come and collect that food and eat and use it for their meals. And what we found is that many of the people need help with cooking skills and recipe ideas to make that work. So for us, things like the community fridge hit the food waste agenda. They help people struggling on low incomes to eat more healthily, and they help also to overcome loneliness because they're a good point in the community for people to gather. So currently the 100 community fridges in the UK are redistributing 1.9 million meals a year to people who most need it. And we think that concept can be involved so that they become sort of community kitchens and a place where people can learn new skills and meet with others and basically get even more value from the food and to eat more healthily. Travel has been another sort of massive issue. And again, the policy asks that we're suggesting revolve around 2 things. One is to boost the shift to electrification. So we've seen massive upsurge in the sales of e-scooters in the UK, and trial schemes for e-scooter hires, which is, we think, an encouraging trend, providing it's properly managed. But we've also seen that there's still a big barrier to people purchasing electric vehicles, which are basically cost. So we're investigating whether there could be a scrappage scheme to help move people to electric vehicles in a way that overcomes that initial cost burden, and to provide more community e-charging points, so it's easier to charge vehicles once you have them. And then on cycling and walking, which is all part of this 15-minute community idea that Dan mentioned, and one which we see is growing relevance across the world, and the concept that, you know, why not be able to get everything that you need within a 15-minute walk of your home, and the importance of having much more localized provision is really important. And cycling is obviously a key part of that. But in the UK, cycling is still missing out on certain sections of the community, particularly the BAME community. So what we'd like to see is much more effort and emphasis put on creating cycling hubs targeted at those women and BME groups who are less likely to take up cycling, so that the benefits of health and cleaner air are shared more widely. And we'll be trialling schemes to do that in some of the most deprived parts of London from the autumn. And then space. So again, one of the things, as Viki alluded to, was that people are much more connected to nature and are spending more time in public spaces. So our call for action here is twofold. One is structural. So we've seen some brilliant schemes in the Netherlands about no roof unused. So, you know, trying to turn sort of grey roofs into either solar roofs or green roofs to help address climate sort of overheating, to look at cleaner air and a better quality environment. And we feel the government could make investment to make it easier for people to make sure their roof is used for a purpose. But also in the UK, we've seen that the link to that greater use of green space has seen an excessive amount of fly tipping and littering. And so we're calling for much more infrastructure across all our cities and green spaces to make it easy for people not to litter and to recycle. And again, this is an area where Hubbub has invested a considerable amount of money putting in recycling schemes into some of our largest cities. We just want to see more consistency across the UK. And then our final policy ask area is on fashion. Fashion is one of the industries that has the largest environmental footprint, and COVID basically, more than probably any other industry, revealed fault lines in the way that the fast fashion industry in particular works. So what we saw was that many orders for clothing into Bangladesh were cancelled, having devastating impact on the workers in those countries. There was a massive overstocking of clothing, so businesses are sitting on large amounts of clothing at the moment. The recycling of clothing has always been a tendency to send it overseas and hope somebody else will deal with it. And basically, a lot of people have decided that they're not going to spend so much on clothing. And so sales have dropped and the retail sector has been severely hit. So to try and address those two things, we're calling on for two things with government. The first is to invest in more innovation so that there can be more production closer to home, and that we can try and revive some of the areas particularly hit by the economic crisis, to bring back skills that were traditional in those areas, and to innovate far more around the circular economy. And then our second ask is actually one that was put forward by one of the parliamentary groups in the UK, which is to put a very small levy on each item of clothing, which is then reinvested into more sustainable solutions, so that people start, some monies are ring fenced to create a more sustainable approach. So those are the policy requests. On the Hubbub website, the Greenprint covers all of the public polling we've done, all of the response from businesses, and summarises the policy asks that we put forward. We know they're only a small part of the bigger picture. We only have a sort of snapshot of the wider world, and there are many other things that need to be done. But for us, the key to this has been to help rebuild the UK in a way which is more just and sustainable, but absolutely crucially puts people at the heart of it and looks to level up a lot of the discrepancies that exist within our society at the moment. So I hope that gives you a good flavour of what we're doing. I will now take off my screen saver. And I think we have time, if there are any questions at all, for people to raise anything they wish in the chat, which is thoroughly empty at the moment. So, but if you have got anything you'd like to ask, please do. Otherwise, we will say thank you very much and end the session. I'll give it a few seconds. Great. A couple of thank yous, but I was going to say we've either bored you to tears or answered everything that you might possibly have to ask. But thank you very much for participating. I hope that was useful, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the festival and event. So thank you very much for your time. Bye.